Good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this COP26 side event on raising resilience ambition, leadership from small islands. My name is Emily Wilkinson. I'm a senior research fellow at ODI, Global Affairs think tank, and knowledge and results lead for the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for Dominica, CREED. This session is going to be about small islands, which are amongst the most climate vulnerable states and islands in the world, some of them facing existential risks to their nationhood as a result of climate impacts. They are also amongst the most deeply affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic downturn, and many have very high levels of debt. This mix of vulnerabilities makes it almost impossible for small island tourism, development islands to spend on development the levels required to build back better and to implement measures that will transform their economies and empower their communities to effectively reduce climate risks. Elevating adaptation and resilience in climate policy and at the negotiations will require leadership and a demonstration of what can be achieved. This is about setting ambitious goals, making progress on mainstreaming adaptation and resilience into and across ministries and all sectors. We have speakers and experts who are going to describe the financing gap and pinpoint some of the support that's needed to achieve these ambitious resilience goals. So let me first introduce our first keynote speaker. We have a high-level segment. And firstly, we're going to hear from Honourable Minister Cozier Frederick. He's Minister of Environment, Rural Modernization and Kalinago Uplift for the Government of the Commonwealth of Dominica. Minister Cozier is a Member of Parliament for the Salibia constituency, which includes the Kalinago territory. He presently serves on the Dominica Reparations Committee and the Kalinago Events Committee, and is a former development officer for the then Ministry of Kalinago Affairs. He is a former teacher at a school in the Kalinago territory. Honourable Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you to the listening audience, friends, colleagues. I just want to add my bit in the conversation as part of the COPs to say that small island states like Dominica is on the front line of climate change. And it's not a cliche, it's the reality. And we faced it in 2017 when we lost more than 226% of our GDP due to Hurricane Maria. But what is most important to note is that we didn't allow a massive hurricane like Maria to cripple us. We regrouped, and we embarked on a journey and to become the world's first climate resilient country. And so we developed a national development strategy and also a climate resilient recovery plan. And all of these have clear targets that we are hoping to achieve by 2030. Now, in the Paris Agreement, Article 7, we speak very, very broadly about the global goals on adaptation. Now, this speaks to enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and also reducing vulnerabilities. I am very, very pleased that this is getting some traction in this COP. And I'm also happy to say that I am the AOC's ministerial champion on that mission. And I hope that the clear timelines can be set and the processes can be agreed upon. In Dominica, we have created a serious roadmap for mitigation and adaptation goals. First, this focus on building strong communities, a robust economy, and well-planned and durable, resilient infrastructure. We are seeing some frequent and more intense storms affecting us in the region. This results in greater damage, of course, and loss of lives and livelihoods. It is important, therefore, for us to build greater individual and communal capacity and resilience. We're ensuring that at the government level, that we have institutionalized resilience, ensuring that it is reflected in our legislation, in our policies, in our sector plans and strategies. So there's a whole government approach to resilience. Equally, We are working with communities to ensure that weaknesses are identified and all appropriate actions taken to minimize risks. This is all geared, for example, at ensuring that we achieve our targets of zero totalities from extreme weather conditions. We're also prioritizing building a very robust economy. This focuses on key elements of skills development, access to finance, diversification of revenue streams, and risk transfer. By far, the most significant financial losses that we have suffered is in infrastructure. This impact is particularly the speed of recovery, particularly of the economy, and so we are taking some deliberate action to improve public infrastructure and to support the strengthening of private institutions. We are building blocks in place to weather-proof our country for impacts of climate change. We're approaching this in a holistic manner to ensure that our youth and future generations can continue to enjoy a reasonable standard of living. We are particularly concerned, however, of the risk of commitments by the world's greatest polluters to reduce harmful emissions and to keep global warming not more than 1.5. We will continue to pound the pavement, to knock on doors until necessary action is taken. In the meantime, we will continue to prepare and adapt to the changing climate for the survival of our people. Critically important is that the richness of our country have grown rich over the practices that have compromised our environment. So we're asking for these countries to do the right thing. As they act to limit their emissions, they must also act to provide the resources, the financial resources that we need to adapt. So I'm very excited that we could get some of that voice out at the COPs as we continue to call as small island developing states, and more particularly one recently hit by one of the most serious storms in recent history.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I must say I'm very impressed to see the huge steps that Dominica has been able to take with very limited resources. And we appreciate the very clear call for support and increased assistance. Our next high-level speaker is the Honourable Juan Pedro Yllanes, Vice President of the Balearic Government and Regional Minister of Energy Transition and Productive Sectors. Vice President Yllanes has served as a judge from 1989 to 2015 and was elected member of the Spanish Parliament for the period 2015 to 2019. Since then, he has been Vice President of the Balearic Government, responsible for energy transition, climate change and adaptation policies. He has been a champion of pioneering climate change and energy transition law, and this legislation places the Balearic Islands at the forefront of the fight against climate change and is a reference for other territories, and is now in the process of development and implementation. Vice President, we look forward to hearing about the experience of the Balearic Islands.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for gathering here all together, government of small islands, to think about and find solutions to address urgent and common challenges regarding change. In my case, I'm going to make a short presentation of how the Balearic Islands, the Balearic government, faces this challenge from our regional perspective. Our geography, expressed through insularity, makes us especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change. We are exposed to more and harder effects than in other areas. The Mediterranean Sea is located in the zero zone of climate change. The latest available scientific studies, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, confirm this fact and warn us. For this reason, we developed a pioneering law on climate change and energy transition, a comprehensive law that was created to respond to the Paris agreements, providing the insular perspective as well as other European initiatives such as the Clean Energy for EU Island, a law that provides us with a multi-level governance framework where each administration is involved. A law with two objectives, mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Regarding the first goal, the law lays down clear and specific objectives for us in terms of reducing emissions, increasing penetration of renewables, and fostering energy efficiency. Regarding adaptation goals, it includes a series of tools to carry out transversal policies in almost all socio-economic sectors, such as energy, tourism, territory, health, etc. What are we doing now in the Balearic Islands? Now we are working in the strategic framework for adaptation. The main tool provided by the law is the Energy Transition and Climate Change Plan, which is currently under development, a plan that contemplates a strategic adaptation framework as a basic point. It has to foresee the climatic scenarios, their impacts, and the different sectors, and ecosystems vulnerabilities. This plan is crucial to make main lines of action emerge in order to increase resilience to climate change, as well as to fix indicators to measure its implementation. Amongst the adaptation elements contained in this law, we also find the inclusion of the climate perspective in policies through a transversal approach. Thus, laws, regulations, budgets, sectorial policies, and other plans must request a report from the Climate Change Department. We are also going to call for grants to municipalities in order to implement measures to adapt to climate change. Thanks to this initiative, many adaptation projects are already being carried out at the municipal level with the application of nature-based solutions. Climate change is already here. The archipelagos are already noticing it. The effects in the Mediterranean Sea are going to be harsher. Mitigating the effects is capital, and that's why in the past few years we've made great strides toward this goal. Moreover, adaptation is also crucial because no matter how much we accelerate the energy transition, there are many effects that are already coming. The main goal is preparing our territory in order to continue developing our lives in it. We have a moral duty to leave a habitable and prosperous planet for the new generations. The young people have led this change in the last years. Now, climate change is one of the top priorities of governments, including the one I represent. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you. That is indeed very interesting, and what a great example of really taking the issues seriously and getting it integrated into legislation and regulations. That's definitely an experience I think other islands would be interested to learn from. Our third keynote speaker is Mr. Courtenay Rattray. He's High Representative for Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries and Small Island Developing States, UN-OHRLLS. Mr. Rattray is a diplomat with a distinguished career in the Jamaican Foreign Service and with managerial leadership experience of working within and across multicultural settings and a focus on addressing developmental challenges in countries in vulnerable situations. Previously, he acted as permanent representative of Jamaica to the United Nations in New York, as well as holding a position as chairperson of several key institutions in the UN. Prior to that, he was ambassador of Jamaica to the People's Republic of China in Beijing, and a director of bilateral relations department and in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade in Kingston, Jamaica. Mr. Rattray is in transit at the moment, but has kindly pre-recorded his keynote speech, which we'll be able to see now.
Excellency Mr. Cozier Frederick, Minister of Environment, Rural Modernization and Kalinago Upliftment of the Government of the Commonwealth of Dominica, Ambassador Aubrey Webson, Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the United Nations at New York, and Mr. Juan Pedro Yllanes, Vice President of the Balearic Government and Regional Minister of Energy Transition and Productive Sectors. From the beginning of the global struggle against climate change, small island developing states have exercised remarkable global leadership. I thank the Overseas Development Institute and the governments of Dominica and the Balearic Islands for recognizing and celebrating that ambition. Given the negligible contribution of SIDS to global emissions, their future, and in some cases their very survival, depends on the decisions of others. And this underlines a fundamental challenge for climate action. Those with the most power to change the future are not the ones with their livelihoods and loved ones at the front line of this emergency. In 1990, SIDS banded together to form the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, and to this day, AOSIS fights not only for their own survival, but the survival of the global ecosystem on which we all depend. Every day, dozens of species become extinct. Coral reefs, including those keeping atoll nations afloat, are dying. Farmland is turning into desert and forests burn, as we know, at unprecedented rates. When we say that we are sounding the alarm, this is not a drill. The flames are literally licking the paint off the walls. They say that no man is an island, and yet too often the member countries of AOSIS have felt bereft of companionship, lonely voices in the international community. Small island developing states standing up for science and making the case loudly and continually to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's what they're doing. SIDS are also leading by example by committing to ambitious climate mitigation in their own countries. The 2019 AOSIS SIDS package is just another example of what it means to be at the forefront and on the front line of climate change. Beyond targeting 100% renewable energy by 2030, this package encourages climate-resilient urbanization and the creation of climate-smart, resilient islands. Antigua and Barbuda, as the chair of AOSIS, is continuing this proud tradition of climate activism and leadership. As they rightly stress, we must move from negotiation to implementation. Simply put, the time for mitigation, adaptation, and resilience building is running out because the signs are just not good. The world is on track to reach 2.7 degrees Celsius. And the commitment of $100 billion for developing countries is yet to be made. Also unmet is implementation of the polluter pays principle. This foundation of the Paris Climate Agreement requires that major emitters, not SIDS, should bear the cost of their emissions. Negative externalities must be internalized, and we must have a price on carbon that allows us to achieve the 1.5 degree temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. And developed countries must radically expand their financial commitments for adaptation and for resilience. However, as each year sees new records of both the frequency and intensity of natural disasters, the bill continues to land with SIDS. Increased debt distress and shrinking fiscal space in turn leaves islands less resilient. To build that resilience, we must find innovative ways of raising finance. Earlier this week, my office, together with the UN Economic Commissions covering all SIDS, launched a new initiative to pilot climate adaptation debt swaps. With adequate funding, these swaps could effectively address both debt and climate vulnerability in SIDS. Antigua and Barbuda is again leading the way by piloting this initiative together with their sister islands of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as well as St. Lucia. on an initiative that we all hope will have a positive impact on small islands right across the world. We've also launched another initiative called the Solar Airport Financing Facility for SIDS. This will bundle solar energy and resilient infrastructure projects into investment portfolios that can attract institutional investors. So we are exploring every idea, every policy, every possibility in our quest to build resilience and provide a safe and prosperous future for SIDS. The IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees stressed that without radical action, SIDS will become uninsurable. We cannot afford to wait. As Secretary General Guterres put it, this is code red for humanity. Extreme events that once happened every 100 years are now expected to hit SIDS every year by 2050. This will, as you know, inflict devastating loss and damage that will have an impact on jobs, community support mechanisms, and healthy ecosystems. Developed countries must recognize that decisions to forego spending on mitigation will result in increased expenditures on resilience building and financing loss and damage. They are, in fact, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and paying Paul will cost them more. While there is no denying the situation is dire, I am proud of the leadership of islanders to build resilience and adapt to climate change. I am optimistic that our message is being heard, but I am also conscious that we must continue to demand that promises made must be promises kept. I thank you.
Thank you very much, High Representative Mr. Rattray. It's great to hear about these collective initiatives and so much focus and attention being paid to vulnerable islands. We are now going to see two wonderful videos, one from the Balearic Islands and one from Dominica, that really highlight some of the challenges ahead, but also the fantastic work around resilience that's being done in small islands. So I do hope you enjoy these videos. We'll watch both of them together and then move on to the panel session.
On the morning of September 19th, 2017, Dominica faced the harsh realities of climate change. The once green and flamboyant nation was transformed into a landfill for the catastrophe that was Hurricane Maria. More than $500 million in infrastructural damages, buildings and businesses destroyed, roofless homes, broken communities and people, roads, bridges, lush vegetation, all washed away and blown away.
I am 60 years old. First time I have ever witnessed that kind of thing.
We buried loved ones yesterday, and I am sure that as I return home tomorrow, we shall discover additional fatalities as a consequence of this encounter. Our homes are flattened. Our buildings roofless, our water pipes smashed, and road infrastructure destroyed. Our hospital is without power, and schools have disappeared beneath the rubble. Our crops are uprooted. Where there was green, there is now only dust and dirt. The desolation is beyond imagination. Mr. President, fellow leaders, the stars have fallen. Eden is broken.
Despite the broken homes, minds, and hearts, Dominica announced its goal to become the first climate-resilient country in the world. Dominica is now marching steadfastly towards that goal by 2030 through building strong communities, construction of resilient housing and other infrastructure, plus regional emergency shelters, supporting the recovery of the agriculture sector, and maintaining its path of being a CARICOM frontrunner in renewable energy use, among other strategic initiatives and projects.
Wonderful. I think you'll agree, very inspiring videos. We're now going to have a panel discussion with three distinguished guests who are going to help delve more deeply into some of these issues around island resilience, their agendas and the challenges that lie ahead. Our first guest is Elena Hinamar Tomás Ribot, who's the technical manager of the Balearic government's climate change adaptation policies. Hinamar holds a degree in environmental science and a master's in landscape intervention and management from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She has extensive experience in environmental assessment of plans and projects in both the public and private sectors. She currently specializes in the area of adaptation, of the climate change and atmosphere sciences of the regional Ministry of Energy Transition and productive sectors of the government of the Balearic Islands. Hinamar, as Vice President has said, the Balearic Islands government passed this law on climate change and energy transition, and the challenge is now to deploy it effectively and increase the resilience of islands. But where do you start? I mean, which priority sectors of the islands do you think we need to work on first to enhance adaptation and resilience?
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to start saying that we, as government, have developed two studies about vulnerability in the islands. The first one was in 2016 and the second one in 2018, focusing on the priority sectors that we thought, energy, water, environment, agriculture, primary sector, water, of course, territorial matters and everything. So we had a roadmap, more or less, with strategic areas in which we should work on. But then we realized that actually adaptation means working on problems that we already know. And we know that we have flooding problems when comes in with storms. And we have problems in running out of sand in the beaches. And we have many problems that needed a global approach. That means that the law did something very important that the Vice President has already said, is focusing on global climate change perspective. This means a huge amount of work for technicians working in the government, because every single plan needs our assessment. That means sitting down in a table and talking about how people could, put their goals on adaptation in what they're planning. And sometimes we have many difficulties in either because we have a lack of scientific knowledges, or because people sometimes need another kind of adaptation or would like to implement another kind of adaptation, which is another question that's very difficult for us. I mean, what's going to be adaptation in the future? When we talk about, for example, I'm coming back to the example I said about the lack of sand that we are having in some beaches, urban beaches, of course, because urban beaches that we have built on, promenades with palm trees that tourism is expected to find when they come to the Balearic Islands. And most of the tourism that come want this kind of beaches, and our economy is basically based on this tourism coming to the islands. So how do we tell them that we have to change this landscape? Because with the climate change, there's no way we can have these beaches because of the level, the rise of the sea level. What people demand sometimes is, okay, let's build decks to protect, the beaches. But these are short-term solutions, and these will be, very an environmental impact for these beaches. So what we need now is to convince people, to sit down and convince people about good adaptation plans, good adaptation projects, such as those ones based on nature-based solutions, like, rethink the cities we have. We have built in very risky areas, or we have occupied territories which are, have increased our vulnerability. We don't have problems with beaches, with natural beaches that have enough place to go back. We have problems with built beaches. So this is one of the main areas in what we work with in the Balearic Islands. And in the end, we are working in all sectors. Of course, tourism is one of the main sectors, but also other sectors as water, because in the future we expect less water and we have to work on it. We have to go through a process on planning how much people can live in the islands, which is where do people live? Do we have the knowledge to say, okay, we cannot build anymore because there's no water for all the people that want to live here in the islands. So we have many goals and many priority sectors in the end to work on with.
Thank you so much, and I think it's really interesting to hear that from you about these sort of very fundamental changes ahead, and what you said about rethinking our cities and rethinking our economies and the kind of tourism model. I think this is something that many islands share a concern about around the world, and I think it's interesting to hear from Spain as well that you're facing similar kind of existential questions really in the Balearic Islands. Thank you. Our next guest is Ambassador Francine Barron. Ambassador Barron is CEO of the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for Dominica and has been a lawyer for 25 years and served as Attorney General of Dominica. She has extensive experience in the diplomatic field, having served as High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, as Ambassador to WTO and the UN office in Geneva. She has also served as Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, and in her role as CEO of CREED, she is tasked with spearheading Dominica's resilience agenda, which includes leading and coordinating strategic initiatives, pursuing the sustainable use of its natural resources, and ensuring that resilience is mainstreamed across all sectors. That is a huge task ahead, Francine, and very, very impressive, this commitment to become the first climate resilient nation in the world. But what do you think what are the biggest transformations underway that will make that a reality?
Thank you very much, Emily. And for Dominica, we're approaching resilience in a holistic manner. We're looking at how do we build physical resilience, environmental resilience, social resilience, financial resilience. Because we realize that we need to adapt to the harmful effects of climate change. The cost to Dominica of taking no action by 2100, we will have lost up to 77% of our GDP. So it's critical for us to take action to address the challenges. And we have done so in developing a climate resilience and recovery plan that looks at how can we, in a holistic manner, address the effects of climate change. And key to that is how do we institutionalize resilience? How do we ensure that in all our legislation, policies, strategies, and plans, we have resilience built into it? And so we're doing we're reviewing and ensuring that all of our plans and strategies and policies include the resilience initiatives. We also have to ensure that we have energy security. And Dominica has as one of its targets by 2030 to transfer and to become 100% renewable, reliant on renewable energy for power generation. So we're looking at a combination of hydro, solar to a smaller extent, and to a large extent geothermal energy. It's clean, green energy that will result in better prices for electricity and also ensure our energy security for the future. We're also pursuing other resources. For example, we're looking at how do we map the other geothermal potential that we have in Dominica. How do we use that to develop downstream activities that can benefit our people, improve their livelihoods? And so we're looking at what private public partnerships we can enter into that will allow us to utilize our resources in a sustainable way and allow us to be able to develop green industries in Dominica. So from geothermal, for example, we can look at green hydrogen, we can look at ammonia, we can use the byproducts of geothermal for agro-processing. So there are a number of spin-off benefits that we can gain from investing in clean energy. We're also looking at our infrastructure. How do we make our infrastructure more resilient to climate change? We are in the hurricane belt in the Caribbean, and we are particularly affected by tropical storms. And for Dominica, for example, in 2015, a tropical storm which had no wind but almost 6 hours of heavy rain caused losses and damage in excess of 90% of our GDP. And this was followed 2 years later by Hurricane Maria, and Hurricane Maria destroyed 226% of our GDP. So for us, as the minister indicated earlier, climate change is a reality. And we had up to 90% of homes and buildings either destroyed or damaged by the storm. And so the imperative is for us to improve the resiliency of our infrastructure. And we have our target to 2030 to have up to 90% of infrastructure either built or retrofitted to resilient building codes. So we have, post Hurricane Maria, we revised our building codes, and the new buildings that are built have to be built in accordance with those building codes. In addition to that, the government has embarked on an initiative to build up to 5,000 climate resilient homes. And in building those homes, government is ensuring that those homes are built in safe areas. Of course, we have challenges in Dominica where we're very mountainous and very beautiful island, but with the mountains come the danger of land slippage. We have lots of waterways and rivers. We say we have 365 rivers, one for every day of the year. But these come with their challenges because when you have an extreme weather event, then you have flooding. So we have to ensure that we put measures in place to reduce the harmful effects of flooding and landslides. So when we build roads, we're ensuring that the roads are built to resilient standards. We look at slope stabilization. We look at how we build retaining walls to ensure that the roads will not be severely impacted by a weather event. And our bridges, our schools, all of our infrastructure that is repaired or built after Hurricane Maria is being built to resilient standards. So we want to ensure that if in the future we are affected by storms, then we do not suffer the same level of damage. We're able to recover quickly and bounce forward. And also, we're looking at how do we build resilient food systems? How do we do agriculture differently? How do we ensure that we have food security that we're able to provide for our people? So one has to look at new methods of doing agriculture, looking at what are the climate resilient systems we can put in place to ensure that our crops are not fully destroyed by hurricanes, and so that we are able to feed our people post-extreme events. And so there's a lot that is being done in Dominica now that is going to take us to where we want to get to by 2030. And we're developing the metrics and indicators to ensure that we follow the progress so that we're able to see how we are progressing towards achievement of that target. So I'll stop here for now, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francine. This is real leadership from a small island, and I know that there is a long way to go, but you are showing really what can be achieved, and across a range of sectors. You've talked about renewable energy, energy security, resilient infrastructure, climate smart agriculture. This is really a very ambitious program, and we very much look forward to seeing how this agenda progresses. Our third panelist for today is Dr. Richard Cozier-Wright. Dr. Cozier-Wright is Director of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division at UNCTAD, and he's worked in the UN, both in New York and Geneva. Dr. Cozier-Wright has published widely on economic issues, including the Economic Journal, the Cambridge Journal of Economics, and the Journal of Development Studies. His latest book is on the resistible rise of market fundamentalism, and he has also edited volumes on transnational corporations, the global economy, economic insecurity and development, securing peace, and climate protection and development. I would like to ask you about the recent report that UNCTAD has produced, its flagship trade and development report, which focuses on adaptation. What do you think are the key takeaways particularly for small islands looking to build resilience? What are the recommendations?
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Well, there's one big takeaway in all this, and it's access to finance, of course. I mean, we heard from my fellow panelists about the particular problems that island economies are facing as temperatures rise. And they're, in a sense, on the front line of a problem that many other developing countries are facing. Many developing countries have a lack of diversified activities, which makes them more vulnerable to external shocks, not just climate shocks, but other shocks, financial shocks and health shocks, etc. And of course, their fiscal space is constantly being squeezed. And once they get hit, and we heard that this can cost up to 200% or more of GDP, then fiscal space is squeezed further. Indebtedness increases, because one of the few ways that you can maintain activity in the face of that kind of crisis is to borrow in international capital markets. Developing countries of all sorts, but particularly island economies, suffer from a weak position when it comes to borrowing on international capital markets. They have to pay a higher premium for access, or they have to engage with the international financial institutions, which often impose their own conditionalities in terms of accessing multilateral finance. So there's a real kind of financial squeeze already facing many developing countries, and as my fellow panelists clearly indicated, the building of resilience itself is an expensive business. You need to make all kinds of investments across your economy to be able to protect against the kind of damage that is already happening and which is only going to get worse as global temperatures rise. And so this is the big question, essentially. Where do we have the financing at the multilateral level to be able to support developing countries in general, but island economies in particular? And at this moment in time, sorry to say, I don't think particularly the advanced economies are taking this issue seriously. We're essentially in a kind of schizophrenic moment. On the one hand, we have the talk about $100 billion for adaptation, which advanced economies have been trying to reach for a decade, which is not a sufficient, at least in our estimation from the report, is not a sufficient amount given the scale of the problem. And on the other hand, we have the private sector dangling $130 trillion worth of assets as if this is ready finance that somehow is going to be channeled into helping developing countries deal with both the mitigation and the adaptation problem. And we don't think, at least, that that is a realistic option at the moment, at least given the way the private financial markets operate. So the big challenge from the perspective of the report is can we scale up the multilateral financial arrangements to be able to support developing countries on the scale that they need? And I think the kind of glass is it's a question of whether the glass is half full or half empty, depending on how you look at it. I think here the pandemic has been an important lesson. In many respects, the initiatives coming, for example, from the G20 with its debt service suspension initiative have clearly not been sufficient given the scale of debt that developing countries face. On the other hand, the use of special drawing rights and the which is the instrument available to the International Monetary Fund, which issued $650 billion worth of special drawing rights earlier this year, opens up some new avenues for serious financing, I think, of the climate challenge. Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados has made a number of proposals in respect to both the debt and the use of special drawing rights that I think the international community needs to take much more seriously. The report has quite a lot to say about these issues. I think we heard recently from a group of developing countries, African countries and like-minded countries here in the COP, that they estimate that developing countries require something in the order of $1.3 trillion a year to deal with the combined mitigation and adaptation challenges that they're going to face. And we have a similar kind of number in the report that we have just issued. And obviously, from our point of view, the advanced economies, it's one thing to make these aspirational statements in this kind of environment. It's another thing to deliver on the kind of financing that developing countries need if they're going to deal with the challenge. And there's a big gap still between aspiration and action, I'm sorry to say, amongst the advanced economies. And just to finish and give you an example of how far behind we are, a lot of the rhetoric that one hears often when faced with these kinds of big financing challenges is to delve into history and discover the Marshall Plan, which is a favorite of many politicians in the North because it's a very successful program. It was the program that helped to rebuild Europe at the end of the Second World War after a massive shock due to military conflict. And it was essentially funded by the United States. It was essentially grant-based. There was some loans, but it was mainly grant-based. And the number that I think that people need to kind of keep in their heads from that history lesson is that the US channeled essentially 1% of its GDP every year to help rebuild Europe for about 5 or 6 years. Now, if you take that number of 1% and impose that on what developed countries in their totality should be doing in response to the climate challenge, you're talking about something in the order of $600 billion a year. If they simply to repeat the experience that got them back on their feet 75 years ago. And these countries are much richer, they're much more diverse, they're much more dynamic than was the case 75 years ago. And they need to recognize their own history and step up to the plate, I think, when it comes to multilateral financing and do what helped them recover after the end of the Second World War.
Thank you very much, Richard. So we should be expecting 600 billion to be made available shortly.
I would hope so.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a very important point, and to look back into history, examples of where finance has been made available, can be made available to step up to the challenge, I think is really, really important. We should keep pressing that home. I want to turn back to Hinamar to talk a bit about the financing side of things as well, because obviously your government and the Balearic Islands are in a slightly different situation because you are part of a developed country, and yet it's a regional government that will have to find the funding itself to address its adaptation resilience challenges. So how are you going about that? Do you wait for the funding, or are there other ways that you can kind of make progress on resilience in the islands?
Thank you. I think it goes very well with it. We do need a lot of funding also. And that's, for example, to put an example right now, before the funding, we need to do a lot of things. And that's also, and who is doing this effort to find the financing is the government, who sometimes needs more technicians working on projects. We are leading, the leadership of adaptation is not in private hands. Mitigation is maybe more, between private and public sector. But I think adaptation is very focused on how public sector is acting. And public sector has problems to, to find consensus, to find, governance is a huge important thing that we're dealing with. As I told you before, because as you want to do a project, you have to deal with many, parts, thinking how this project should be done. And it's very difficult to change minds. To go, your resilience needs a very, an important change of how our future territory is going to be. So going to what you're saying, we are doing the same, working in every single plan, every single project. That means you don't need to finance, but to think about how these projects are going to be. And you need, what I said, a network in which all agents are working together. We are now part of the Covenant of Majors. I don't know if you heard about it. Hopefully, yes. It means that regions and municipalities are planning also how to deal with resilience. So we go from these, big global look to these more municipal needs. And what we are trying to do is to work with them so that they are the ones telling us, okay, we have these projects, we need money to do them, and that's what we are trying to do now. It's to go to small funding, let's say that, so that in the future we can get more ambitious and do more, to be all together working on resilience, which is one important thing. Another important thing is to deal with many projects, a lot of projects that people want to do, that in the end, after 4 years, get into, there's new governments, and then these projects that have been a huge amount of work, of all people working together with a change of governments, then they get in nothing, which is very important, that the whole society agrees in what is going to be done, so projects don't get lost after such an important work. And to talk, you have many problems with vulnerability, with storms and everything. We do have also problems. We are more resilient to them, so that's what developed countries have managed until now. Sorry for my English. But it's true that we have built in many places, and people are in risk, and it's difficult to get back. We have occupied to such the territory, and our economy is based on that, and it's very, very hard to go back. And well, So it's true that we can deal with adaptation, just thinking, just collaborating, just working together with community, with scientific community, and finding ways to do things better in the future. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, and I think you made some really important points there about, as well as the financing, it's about planning ahead, making sure that there's not kind of more risk being built into the particularly urban environment. So I think it's as much about, you know, the way that planning happens, making sure that it's a kind of whole of government and whole of society approach that's really at the heart of everything that you do, in order for that to be sustained as well through changes in government and all kinds of other things that that can kind of interrupt that vision. And I wanted to turn back to Francine and ask you also about that, really. So resilience, you know, it's not a one-off effort. It needs to be sustained over time. How confident are you that this kind of momentum that happened after Hurricane Maria in 2017 will be maintained over the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years? You know, is resilience here to stay? I guess that's the question.
Well, Emily, the simple answer to that question is that resilience for us is a question of survival. So, yes, it is here to stay. Fortunately for us, I think there is the political will on both sides for Dominica to become resilient, and the citizens are behind it. Having come from the experience of Hurricane Maria in 2017 and the destruction that we faced, I think all citizens are aware of the need for us to become resilient, because for us, it really is a question of survival. And in terms of sustaining the momentum, it's very important, and we're making the argument here at COP, that there must be consideration of funding for loss and damage. So my colleague from UNCTAD had spoken to the issue of up to 600 billion really needs to be put, maybe even more than that, needs to be set aside for allowing small island developing states, developing countries, to be able to make the changes that are necessary to become more resilient. And I just wanted to add to what he was saying. In the scenario that he explained, where funding was made available after the World War to assist Europe, we're looking at a situation here where the reason that we are facing what we are facing now is as a result of the actions of the developed world. So they are responsible for what we are experiencing. And so there's a moral obligation on these countries to assist our countries to mitigate and adapt to the harmful effects of climate change. And so when we speak about things like climate justice, this is what we are referring to. And so for countries like Dominica, with limited resources, being very vulnerable to external shocks, being countries that are highly indebted, and our indebtedness is largely as a response to continuous climate disasters. And so we cannot do it on our own. We need the support of the international community. We need the support of those who have made it difficult for us to help us to adapt to what we are now experiencing. And when we have to think that the world has warmed by 1.1 degrees and we're heading towards 2.7, if serious action is not taken by the industrialized, the developed world, and we see what happened to the Caribbean in 2017 and in 2018 by hurricanes. And hurricanes are not the only thing that we will have to deal with as a result of climate change. We're looking at questions of drought, of damage to our corals, sea level rise. There's so many challenges that we have to deal with as a result of climate change. And when you think about the level of damage that we suffer just from the storms, not even counting all of the other things that we will be facing, it is critical that these countries step up to the plate and put some money on the table so that work can be done by small states to be able to adapt and really to be able to have a future for our young people. So yes, I think the momentum will be sustained, but the effectiveness of it is going to depend on whether these countries come to the table and put the funding that is required to allow us to adapt and to allow us to survive. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about the future, but also the very kind of urgent need for support, because these events, you know, they come quite often, they're quite frequent now, and I guess every hurricane season there's that kind of nervousness there's going to be another Maria. I just wondered, you know, what scale of support are we talking about here? What are the kind of, what sort of assistance does Dominica need? And what's your strategy for accessing that concessional finance and that kind of attracting the investment that will be required?
Well, initially, the funding that we require is grant and concessional financing. Again, we can't borrow ourselves out of where we are now. It has to be an understanding of creating new instruments that can be available to Dominica and other small island states to be able to make the massive investments that are required. We have costed preliminarily some of the initiatives that we want to achieve by 2030 at about 7 to 8 billion. Now, some of it can be met by the country, but some up to 4 to 5 billion has to come from outside. And this cannot be loans that are made available to us. It has to be grant financing, it has to be concessional financing. And we have used our own resources to a large extent to fund the recovery process. Promises were made after Hurricane Maria to support us in our recovery process, but that has been slow in coming and in some instances non-existent. And so we have had to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and get use the resources that we have to respond. But even with our attempts to respond, we're hit by the COVID pandemic, and that health crisis has caused its own challenge for small states. And as my colleague from UNCTAD has indicated, even the suspension of debt initiative has not gone far enough. So there's a lot more that needs to be done. We have access to the Green Climate Fund, but it's such a protracted process for us to be able to draw down on funds from the Green Climate Fund. So sometimes it takes up to 5 to 6 years for you to be able to start a project from the time that you have submitted the proposal. And sometimes before you're able to start the project, the scope of the project has changed because a storm has intervened in between. So really and truly, we need the solutions that have been put on the table. My colleague from UNCTAD indicated that certain suggestions have been made from small island developing states, particularly from the Prime Minister of Barbados, which reflects the CARICOM position. And we need for serious consideration to be given to those proposals that are being put by SIDS. We are seeking to help ourselves, but we need others to come on board to support us in the actions that we are trying to make. So I'll stop here for now.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Francine. Richard, I wanted to ask you, a bit more about kind of the opportunities and the sort of the financing that might become available. You mentioned the use of special drawing rights as a potential source of finance for some of these adaptation resilience ambitions. Is there anything else that you've seen in the announcements this week at COP26 that you think has shifted the dial on the global adaptation challenge for small islands and others, and that you think there's scope or there's room for optimism?
Yeah, I mean, there have been some pronouncements that I think at least are an indication that the international community is kind of paying more attention to the challenge. I mean, everyone knows that adaptation has been the neglected orphan of the climate negotiations. It doesn't have the kind of headline news that mitigation target setting tends to have, and I think has been neglected as a consequence. Unfortunately, I'm not sure we have the narrative yet to handle the adaptation problem. Colleagues have already mentioned that adaptation in particular does not lend itself to private financing. The kind of returns that private financing expects is not likely given the nature of the challenge, given the uncertainty surrounding it, which does mean that public finance, and particularly international public finance, has to be in the driving seat of the adaptation. And there, I don't think we have seen a lot of movement. There have been some initiatives. I think I heard Ambassador Rattray in the previous session talk about debt for climate swaps, and there's certainly opportunities there. I think on the debt issue is an incredibly important one. Dealing with the debt problem, I think, is absolutely paramount for many developing countries, including small island economies, if we're going to make progress on the financing front. And it's really one of the real weaknesses in the multilateral system. We don't have proper mechanisms for dealing with sovereign debt stress and sovereign debt problems. It's never been part of the Bretton Woods architecture. The IMF and the World Bank do deal with it, but they're both creditors. And if we're going to have a sustainable solution to the debt problem, you need a balance between the interests of the creditors and the interests of the debtors. That has to be part of the structure, and we don't have that. Sadly, at the moment, and UNCTAD has long argued that we need some sort of sovereign debt workout mechanism that is not driven by creditors if we're going to come up with kind of timely and effective debt restructuring to put developing countries in a better position to be able to mobilize the resources that they need, not only for the climate challenge but for the sustainable development goals more generally. And I didn't hear a lot about that challenge in the COP. So I think that's missing. I think the other thing, because of the focus that somehow markets will solve this problem, which we don't believe in UNCTAD and never have, I have to say. We're missing out on the details of the policy agenda when it comes to adaptation, at least, and again, the report was very adamant about this. You need some kind of industrial policy, productive policies to deal with many of these problems. You need a kind of strategic planning kind of framework to deal with these problems. And I'm sorry to say that a lot of the discourse, particularly from the Washington-based institutions over the last 30 years, has been to either ignore or belittle the use of these kinds of instruments in helping developing countries mobilize and diversify their economies. And I think we need to get back to we need more instruments on the table to be able to deal with this problem. We need industrial policy. We need the use of public procurement to be much more effective. We need to think in a planning mindset to be able to deal with these problems in a constructive way. And I think the multilaterals have their own learning to do if they're going to be a constructive player in meeting this challenge.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, and I'm sure there's plenty of other kind of good ideas and insights in the report. So I would encourage viewers to have a look. I want to kind of close by just asking each of you what you would like to see happen over the next year. We're coming towards the end of COP. I think there's still a lot of things to be worked out, and maybe it's a bit too early to speak about the conclusions and the final statements. But what needs to happen over the next year? What would you like to see happen that could kind of really move things along, be in a better position at COP27 in Egypt to have, if we come back and have this discussion again, we'll be in a better position to talk confidently about the adaptation agenda, adaptation and resilience as being kind of firmly on the agenda. I don't know if each of you would like to comment on that. Maybe I'll start with Francine.
Okay. Emily, I think what we want to see, work has been done on the global goal on adaptation, and we want to see coming to the next COP in Egypt that we have a concrete process in place for how we will address that global goal on adaptation. There's some key things that we want to achieve as small island states within this COP itself, which is the issues of ensuring that commitments are made that will limit the rise of temperature to not more than 1.5 degrees above industrial levels. And also the question of loss and damage, the question of funding being made available, not only available, but easily accessible and affordable. And therefore, that will allow small states to be able to take the actions that they need to take in order to ensure the survival of their people and their people's livelihoods. So we're hoping that we're in Egypt next year, that would have been resolved and we would have seen some traction. The promises were made since Paris to make 100 billion available. And as we've discussed here, 100 billion is not even enough, but not even that has been met. And so there needs to be a commitment and from the larger countries to make the funds available that are necessary for our small states' survival. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's being discussed, and certainly there's a lot of support around the idea of having some kind of loss and damage window within the climate finance architecture. I think that's very much being pushed towards the front of the agenda. Hiname?
Well, actually, what was said, very interesting, is that adaptation needs to be even more in the agenda. It's not enough. I mean, we have talked a lot about mitigation, but adaptation, actually, still in Majorca and small islands, when you talk about climate change, it's already known that we have to do something to mitigate, but it's not that people are not that conscious that climate change is already there. I mean, it's true that when we talk with society about needs, about adaptation needs, they're not even sometimes they're not even conscious of how urgent this action is. That means that sometimes it's not in the agenda, and that's very important for us. But there's also another difference. We depend on Spanish state and we depend on Europe. I mean, we have competences divided. We cannot decide. For example, in our coast, we have no competences in deciding what to do in the coast. So we depend on Spain. So small islands need also to be able to have decisions on some places. What we need is more competences. So if these issues are in the agenda, if next COP 27 manages that, we will also be able to go further in adaptation in our islands.
That would give it more prominence at home as well. That's brilliant. Great, thank you, Richard. We have less than 2 minutes. Please, what would you like? What do you think needs to happen over the next year before we get to COP27?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I mean, UNCTAD is new to this issue of climate to some extent. I guess what surprised me, and particularly with the adaptation question, is the way in which a development perspective is not the lens through which it's understood. And I find that quite surprising, because for me, adaptation is a quintessential development challenge. And I think one of the problems that has arisen from that lack of a development perspective is the way in which adaptation is kind of siloed in this climate world. And unless you bring in the issues of finance, unless you bring in the issues of trade, unless you bring in the issues of intellectual property into the narrative, I think it's very difficult to fashion a coherent set of policies that can deal with the adaptation in a sustained way. So I think breaking down those silos, thinking of adaptation as a quintessential development problem, making sure that the IMF, the WTO, the WIPO are very much understanding of the challenges that developing countries face in this context, I think is going to be critical if we're going to come up with a more holistic approach to the problem.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Many thanks to our esteemed speakers and panelists, to the governments of the Balearic Islands and Spain, the government of Dominica, and our UN partners, UNCTAD and ALLS, for this wonderful session. I've very much enjoyed discussing this important topic with you, and I hope that we can continue to push this agenda forward in the coming years. Thank you very much for taking part. Bye.